So far in previous videos, I have covered not only that Hamartia is physical in nature, but how and what part of the human brain it affects, as well as how this abnormality in the human brain produces the distinctly human concepts of good and bad, that is, human morality. I now want to turn to asking how this abnormal amygdala and the overreactive survival responses which result could have anything to do with what is often called the human ego, or self, as this is frequently implicated where Hamartia is concerned and even associated with Hamartia. How could the human ego be produced as a result of these things? In order to answer this question, I have to introduce a concept which is squarely within the realm of theology or even philosophy. This is the concept of the imago Dei, that is, the image of God. This is a concept that Christian theologians and philosophers have debated endlessly as far as what it actually means. We first encounter it in Genesis 1, where Moses writes that humanity was created in the image of God, both male and female. Was it referring to a literal physical image? Was it referring to a moral quality, character, or personality? Origen, writing in the 3rd century CE and equating it with spirit, described it in Greek as the nous, that is, the mind or intellect. As God is described as a consuming fire in the scriptures, so also Origen saw the human nous, or spirit, as being at the very least made in the image of this same fire. The other significant place in the scriptures where the imago Dei is mentioned is in the letter of Paul the Apostle to the Colossians, where Jesus Christ is specifically called the image of the unseen God. And this is where I want to focus. Here I want to draw from both Paul's writings and John's, and I think you'll see why. John records Jesus as saying, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father," and also, "The Father and I are one." In the beginning of John's Gospel, he explicitly identifies Jesus Christ using the Greek word logos, which in their cultural worldview was enormously significant. In his letters, where John uses the word logos, Paul uses the word translated as Christ, Christos, as virtually interchangeable with John's usage. And so it is not a stretch to identify the logos as in fact the image of God. But how does that help us here? The ancient Hellenistic worldview was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, and in particular in the 1st century the Stoic philosophy and ethics, which became as ubiquitous within the Roman Empire as Protestant Christian ethics and worldview are within American culture. Far from originating as a Christian concept, the idea of the logos as being identified with the God and firstborn of all creation was foundational to the pagan Stoic worldview long before its entry into 1st century Jewish thought, and then into Christian thought. This is significant because along with this was the idea that every human being contained a piece, or literally a shred, of that same divine logos within them. Epictetus, in his discourses, is adamant that all human beings are, in this way, born from the God, and could be considered children or sons of the God, and thus should start acting like it. Paul, in his letters, echoes this very same idea when he talks about people being members or parts of the body of Christ, joined together with one another and connected to the head as the one governing the whole, which is Christ himself, or the Logos. And so just as the Logos is the image of God, so also every human being who contains the image of God being a part of the Logos. Without spending a lot more time on this subject so that we may return to the problem of the ego, I want to add that this same concept can be found in other philosophies and major religious thought as well, such as Hinduism, where there is the idea of the universal Atman, from which all human beings possess a part, an Atman. There is also the many testimonies from people who have had near-death experiences, who, upon being resuscitated, have reported experiences confirming a oneness between their own conscious awareness and the universal consciousness, or source, as they describe it. Given that this image of God, according to Scripture, is the state in which human beings were originally created, and the example of this is the Logos incarnate, who declared, "If you have seen me, you have seen the Father," it stands to reason that the image of God, as exemplified by Jesus Christ, is the original, natural, functional state for all human beings. So then, if every human being is in some way a piece or part of the Logos, or a piece or part of God, then why then doesn't every human being automatically follow the same example that Jesus Christ set? If this is our natural state, being one with the God in some real way, why are we not immediately aware of it? Why do we not have access from birth to it like Jesus, the Logos incarnate, did? The answer is Hamartia. From the purely theological or philosophical, I want now to return to what can be observed and studied. Some time ago, a friend recommended a book to me, Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors by Janina Fisher. This book talks about the neurobiological basis of compartmentalization of the mind. The fascinating premise of Dr. Fisher is that rather than just a response to extreme trauma in childhood, such as produces dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, the brain actually uses either total or partial fragmentation or self-alienation in order to cope with trauma as a rule. While DID is the most extreme version of this, and the easiest to see as the personalities are distinctly compartmentalized and separate from one another, partial compartmentalization can be seen in people who might otherwise appear on the surface to have a fully integrated personality. In the book, which is incredibly well documented, she describes people who are able to put on a separate self in order to function with relative normalcy in work, school, and social situations, but internally remain broken and traumatized from past wounds, often succumbing to self-destructive behavior and addiction in order to quiet that still hurting self. In other words, this person, even though a single identity, can operate as two separate personalities because the brain compartmentalized the core personality to protect itself, while creating another to take the trauma in a similar though milder way to DID. The brain's survival system was only meant to deal with physical threats. It was meant to react to the threat or survival need by taking control, dealing with it, and then going to standby, so to speak. But the primary driver, if you will, was to be this image of God consciousness, fully aware of and in communication with its governing person, the Logos, or the God. But with the amygdala enlarged and restructured from its original parameters, the human brain is constantly in a survival response to varying degrees, and so the system can't or won't go into standby and allow the image of God consciousness to resume full control. Because our survival response system is always active due to the abnormal amygdala, it reacts with fear, aggression, or a craving for things like food or sex to nearly everything. This results in a total disruption of communication between the source of our consciousness and our brain. This can only be traumatic to the brain, which was not originally designed to function without it. Being then blinded to the genuine source of identity and control, the brain panics and devises its own in order for it to continue to function. The human brain is reacting to the trauma of fear-induced separation from that source of consciousness. That is, the person we identify with from birth, our core personality, is itself the brain's first and original compartmentalization in response to the trauma of being blinded from the source of consciousness due to the malfunctioning and overactive survival response. The self we identify as is itself a fiction created by the brain in order to continue functioning in its perpetual emergency panic state. This self is what we call the ego. With what then does the brain create this compartmentalized personality, being unable to communicate with its original governor? It turns to those things which trigger its survival threat or need response, that is, those things that please or displease it specifically, and those things within its physical sensory environment. I wrote on my blog at one point regarding this. Furthermore, our assignation of good or bad to those things which please or displease, what the brain's fight, flight, feeding, and sex response system mistakenly registers as survival necessities or survival threats, further reinforces those things as part of our personal identity, with which the ego uses to define itself, being a product of that malfunctioning fear survival response. And also, the things which please or displease us we latch onto as what we identify ourselves with. I like chocolate cake. Me liking chocolate cake is a part of my identity. I was born in America. If this pleases me, then it becomes a part of my identity which I treasure. If it displeases me, it becomes a part of my identity I am ashamed of, but still a part of my identity. I write rambles, and it has become a part of my identity that I do so. Being a Christian has been a part of my identity for a long time. But the point is that the ego builds the illusion of identity around those things which either please or displease, which it either agrees with or disagrees with. This is why it can be so psychologically threatening when something which is agreed with or disagreed with is challenged. Even something as inane as fictional stories or characters. My agreement with, for example, that Han shot first in the original Star Wars becomes a part of my identity and who I consider myself to be. Thus, when it is changed by the filmmaker, it threatens that identity. In reality, I don't personally care. I figured that it was George Lucas's call and he can do whatever he wants with his film. But, going back to what I was saying, so it threatens that identity and thus threatens me psychologically. Much to my own surprise, I discovered that I was not the first to recognize the connection between the ego and the survival responses. Thich Nhat Hanh writes in The Art of Living, in Buddhist psychology, the part of our consciousness that has a tendency to create a sense of self is known in Sanskrit as manas. Manas manifests from deep in our consciousness. It is our survival instinct, and it always urges us to avoid pain and seek pleasure. Manas keeps saying, this is me, this is my body, this is mine, because Manas is unable to perceive reality clearly. Manas tries to protect and defend what it mistakenly thinks is a self. The ego clings to various things in order to form personal identity to define itself, even though it in itself is an illusion or delusion created by a brain which is not functioning according to its original parameters. Furthermore, because the ego or self-identity is compiled or aggregated from what the brain recognizes as needs or threats, likes or dislikes, attachments or aversions, and those things become integrated into the self-identity, any threat to the object of that attachment or aversion is seen as a threat to the ego or self-identity. Hence, the survival response is triggered when the object is perceived to be under threat, just as if that person themselves was under threat. This is all well and good, but there can't possibly be any proof to this hypothesis of the formation of the ego, right? Absolute proof? No, of course not. But there are some interesting corroborations from spiritual writings and practices. The first, again, is Jesus Christ himself. Paul, in his letters, was insistent that he was without hamartia, and it has been the continuous teaching of Christianity that he was born without it. As he was born without it, he was identified with God as the Logos, an image of God. As I wrote at one point, it occurs to me that without the inherited malfunction, when Jesus Christ was born, his brain would not have been born in the same panic mode, which the rest of us are born with. His brain would not have jury-rigged an emergency OS, so to speak. That is, an emergency operating system. It wouldn't have needed to. He would have been born with his own name, his own free will and intellect, his own set of experiences, preferences, biology, and so on, but without the malfunctioning ego which plagues the rest of us. He would have been born with full connection to, submission to, and cooperation with that consciousness of I am, which is also the foundation, the base upon which all of creation is coded or shaped. He would have been born enveloped in his Father's presence and love from the start, without any kind of resistance to it. His personality, aside from the clearly human, experiential, and biological component, would have been otherwise entirely shaped by this unbroken connection with the Father, the Source. And these two non-competing components of his individual personality, human and source, if you will, can be observed from the Gospel writings. Jesus Christ represents a human being the way a human being was meant to function, with full connection and cooperation with the Source consciousness, if you will, the Father, from the start. The second is that in every spiritual and mystical tradition, one's ego or self-identity must somehow be set aside or disengaged from in order to experience a unity with God, or in the case of Buddhism, nirvana. This includes Paul's writings, as he writes at length in the 6th, 7th, and 8th chapters of his letter to the Romans about the need to die to one's old man, synonymous with the flesh, in order to function or operate by means of the Spirit. There is also where John says in his first letter that the person who doesn't love doesn't know the God, because the God is love. And also, love brought to completion tosses fear out. Paul writes as well, walk in the Spirit, and you will not bring the desires of the flesh to completion. And so there is this continuous understanding through the writings of the New Testament that either the flesh, corrupted by Hamartia, is in control, or God is in control via the Spirit. But they are not in control at the same time, and cannot be. When the brain and body are under the control of the original governor, then the ego or self-identity produced by the malfunctioning amygdala cannot be, because the love that God is will send the constant panic response of the amygdala into standby. When the amygdala is in control, it disrupts communication with the original governor, and the ego or self-identity takes control. This can also be seen in the testimonies and reports of people who have experienced near-death experiences where the ego has been severely affected, and they report an increased love and compassion towards everyone else. Now, is this actually the origin of the human self-identity or ego? I think the clues that I have just talked about are compelling. I hope, though, that this does explain more my evolving thought on what the image of God is and the origins of our self or ego as we experience it.